I see you.
You can, do you have the participant list up? You can see the chat.
Yeah, I can see it. Yep.
Okay. Well, I'm going to get us started since we're still letting a few people in. Welcome everybody. Really happy to see you. Glad we could still catch some of you, even if there's the sun finally coming out and you might be tempted to go off and take a walk on the sunshine. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Randall Akee to us today. And before we get started, I'm going to invite Jessica Godwin to give us all a little heads up about the student meeting with Dr. Akee at some point after this.
All right, yeah, students, I've sent a couple reminders and I'll drop the Zoom link in the chat now and closer to the end, but after seminar, and remember it won't follow directly this week, it's at a special time at 3 p.m. You'll be invited to have a nice conversation, just students, with Dr. Akee and hosts our CSD fellow Asia Sutton and other grad student from EPI, Leah Neff Warner. So yeah, 3 p.m. and I'll put the link in the chat now and at the end.
Thanks. And before I get to the introduction, let me just remind everybody, those of you who haven't been to the seminar via this webinar platform, we use the Q&A function to provide, offer your questions. Dr. Akee has mentioned that he's willing to be interrupted with regards to clarifying questions along the way. We'll try to wrap up by about 1:15, 1:10 to allow for, back and forth Q&A. When we do the Q&A and you are a person on one of the participants, I can bring you in to allow you to actually ask your question verbally, as well as having had written it there so that you can have a good back and forth with Dr. Akee anyway. The other thing is chats are sent to the panelists and the hosts and not to everyone. So it's better to use the Q&A function. When we're just to get us started here, for students, for the benefit of students and for the rest of us, Dr. Akee has become a population researcher, having started out his career in political economy. He's evolved his work to be a labor economist. Very interesting career. And now he is an associate professor in public policy, public affairs, and American Indian Studies, so a joint appointment in UCLA. He's also a non-resident fellow with the Economic Studies program at Brookings and a faculty research fellow at MBER in labor studies and children's groups. And he has many other hats that he's worn, including he's a research fellow at the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development at the Institute for the Study of Labor, and affiliated with the Population Research Center down in UCLA, which is our sort of a sibling sister group. His research has looked at the determinants of migration and human trafficking, the effects of changes in household income on educational attainment, the effect of political institutions on economic development, and the role of property institutions on investment decisions. He has a really diverse, as you can say, diverse portfolio of research, and we're looking forward to his talk on immigration and immigrant outcomes. So welcome, thanks for coming virtually.
Thank you for having me. Let me put the full screen up. So yeah, thanks for inviting me and thanks for having me. I'm Randy Akee. I'm at UCLA. I'm talking to you from Tovangar, which is the ancestral home of the Gabrielino Tongva people here in the Los Angeles basin. And so as we were talking, this is research that I've done in collaboration with Jimmy Chin, who's at MIT, and Daniel Crown, who's at the Congressional Budget Office. And I'll just read the disclaimer that this presentation is not subject to CBO regular review or editing, and the views expressed here should not be interpreted as CBO views. They are those of the three of us, the authors. And this is research that I've been doing in collaboration with my two co-authors over the course of the pandemic. We've had a little bit of a delay because of access to data in this time period. A bunch of this data is administrative data. I'll explain it coming up, and it's confidential use. But you'll see some of the relative benefits of using this type of data, especially in this context, I believe, where longitudinal data sets for immigrants are almost impossible to collect, and where they exist, they're few and far between, or the number of observations are few and far between. And using administrative data as we do in this analysis really allows you to get a broad sense of, or you get enough observations in order to do some of the statistical analyses that we typically do in other aspects of quantitative analysis. And so with that, the focus of today's work will be immigrant earnings assimilation in the modern era. We've seen, and we distinguish this because we've seen some really novel work from Abramitsky, Bustan, and others that have looked at using historical censuses, linking at the individual level to look at impacts of immigration and not necessarily earnings, because it's from the early 1900s, but employment assimilation, for instance, and language assimilation. So, just to sort of motivate this, understanding earnings assimilation of immigrants is important for policymakers and researchers. It's, some of the rationale behind changes in immigration laws and naturalization processes, as well as whether or not allocations of certain types of visas are expanded, extended, or even begun. And the academic literature, much of the concern has been about the potential for changing labor market quality of immigrant flows to the U.S. And many of these studies have looked at labor market assimilation of immigrants. As I mentioned earlier, one of the difficulties in studying this is the lack of longitudinal data and for immigrants, which makes it particularly difficult to identify selective outmigration in purely cross-sectional studies that leads to complications and potential biases in the analysis of earnings assimilation of the immigrant population. And so, understanding these earning assimilation of immigrants is also beneficial for Social Security outcomes and Congressional Budget Office, which, are interested in being able to model these types of changes and the amount of taxes and the different population compositions that will exist in the US with immigration flows and or the return migration of immigrants, for instance. So what do? We use an administrative longitudinal data set to look at several facts about immigration over the period 1981 to 2017. So a relatively long period of immigration, to look at immigrants in the US. And we end up finding that for the more recent arrival cohorts, relative to the earlier ones in the 80s, we find that there's increasing initial earnings for immigrants over time for men, but not necessarily for women. And I'll show you the data as we get there. We find that as well that individuals who return migrate, so who leave the US, are not in our data, after being in the data for some period of time, they tend to have lower earnings relative to those who stay permanently in the US at all points in time. Bringing up some, suggestive theoretical, sort of possibilities here that return migration is based on, earnings and perhaps even initial early years integration or labor market success. And again, I'll show you some of those results coming up. And we also find that the earnings trajectories, so the over time movement of the average earnings of individuals that eventually will return migrate at some point in this period that we're looking at, they actually in more recent arrival cohorts have a downward sloping earnings trajectory. And we think it's an interesting novel finding, and we're open to some interpretation and discussion about what might be driving that. And we'll contrast that to earlier arrival cohorts where the earnings trajectory is a little bit more level than horizontal than recent years. So the data set that we end up using is the Social Security Administration Continual Work History Sample, the CWHS, which is a 37% longitudinal data set. And it's essentially 1% sample of all Social Security numbers in the US that were started in starting from 1978 to 2017. We actually have to truncate a little bit. We have to start in 1981 because uncensored W-2 earnings, which is what we're going to be looking at, really only are well reported in the data from 1981 onward. And so what we do is we restrict our analysis to foreign-born people, ages 25 to 45 upon arrival. And then we take up a similar population for the native-born so that we can have a comparison group. The way we impute arrival year to the US is the year of the issuance of a Social Security number for foreign-born people. We've tried an alternate, which is we consider the first year of your earnings to be the year of arrival, and we get qualitatively very similar results. And then we come up with our own definition of immigration in this data set as the permanent absence of earnings for the foreign-born population from a single year and all years until the end of our data set. What that means is, so if we see you and you pop up in our data set in 1990 and you're earning some positive amount, and we see you in 1991, 92, 93, and 94, and then in 95, you don't have earnings, you just don't appear in the data, but you appear back in 96, we consider you, still in the data set. Right? Again, people may leave for 1 year, 2 years for various reasons. But as long as you have, a subsequent year that you appear back in it, we consider you, a resident in the US. On the other hand, if you start off in 1990, have earnings for 91, 92, 93, and then in 95 you disappear, and then you never have earnings again, as reported to the W-2s, we consider you a return migrant. So again, there may be some questions on this of, the informal versus formal labor market, and clearly that's something we can't distinguish between. So really, we're focusing on the immigrants employed in the formal labor market, which in this literature is something that's typically has to be done anyway for much of the analysis. And I will. We show it in the paper, we reference it in the paper, in other work that I've done with other colleagues using census, American Community Survey data. We have actually shown that the people whose earnings, who disappear in this time period, not exactly this same time period, but a slightly different data set, a time period as well, is that we've tried to match them to the US Census, for instance, and we found that about only 4% of those who don't have continuous earnings in those periods are in the US. So we think our assumptions that when you at one point have earnings in the formal labor market and for multiple years and then disappear, there's about a 96% chance that you're not currently in the US, at least based on that one matching that we did with the US Census in a different set of analyses. And so that's going to be our way of identifying the return migrants, this idea that at some point, an individual doesn't have subsequent earnings. And remember, we're starting off with a sample that are restricted to ages 25 to 45. So retirement is probably not a big issue. Death might be an issue, but not in a large systematic way, not for this age group, this population. So just to give you a sense of what the data looks like, these are three of the cohort, these are 5 years worth of data. There's more individual data throughout, but just to give you a characteristic sense of what the data looks like, the average age of the immigrant population is, ranges between 34 to 35 across all these years. Annual earnings, these are in real dollar amounts for 2017, are much lower in 1981 than they are by 2017. And again, these are, real adjusted dollars. So they're about $21,000 1981 and about 34 or $1,000 in 2017, suggesting that there's some selection, towards the higher end of the skill distribution and earnings distribution in particular. The proportion female has increased slightly from 45% to 48, 49% over time. The country shares have shifted to some extent. Mexico comprised, more than 20%. By 2017, it was less than that. And that was made up by gains made. And so these are, just to be clear, these are the 5 largest immigrant flow countries in recent years anyway. And India has more than doubled its proportion of the flow. It started off as 2% in the 80s and is almost 8% of the flow in the 2000s. The Philippines has remained mostly constant, but China has also greatly increased its proportion of people flowing into the US from less than 2% to over 5%. And El Salvador has also increased. For the native born, the average age is in the mid 30s. Earnings are, $30,000 to $37,000, and the fraction female is about the same, almost 48, 49%. So this is just an overall picture of, again, using our definition of immigrant flow based on the issuance of Social Security numbers. This 1986 spike here is due to the Immigration Reform Act of 1986, and you see that's a big jump, and then everything else has been fairly constant amounts over the remainder of the time period. If we disaggregate that by country of origin, you'll see that there's a relatively large jump for issuance of Social Security numbers for immigrants from Mexico over this time period, but then it tapered back down to, and again, this is a 1% sample, so these numbers should be multiplied by 100 if you want to get a national amount. In this range over the next few decades. I'll show you the other top 4 immigrant sending countries here as well. And you see that there's just level differences. Remember, Mexico was above 2,000 in all years, but the other top sending countries are nowhere near that amount. And again, they're India, China, the red line is the Philippines, and the orange line is El Salvador. Okay. So the first set of results that I'll show you, I think, are useful for understanding an important component of what we think this data set really allows us to see. It's this, the relative size of return migration that occurs over all immigrant cohorts at all points in time. So the way to read this figure is across the x-axis, we have years. So those would be the immigrant arrival cohorts. And across the y-axis, we show the share of that original cohort that arrived in a particular year in each subsequent year. And we look at this for 10 years for each of the cohorts. So for instance, this first arrival cohort in 1978 is this blue line here. By definition, all of the new immigrant arrivals are there. By 1 year later, there's a few percentage points reduction. By year 2, there's about 5 or 6% reduction. By year 1, 2, 3, 4, about 10% have already left the data set. And again, our claim is they've left the country. And here's 10 years later, almost 20% of that original flow has left the United States. And you can see that's almost constant for that 20% sort of benchmark, holds mostly constant for almost all different years. These last couple of years here are a little bit mechanical because we don't have that many more years to go out. So we're counting someone perhaps arbitrarily more likely not to be in the US than they actually are because they may show up again in subsequent years, but our data only goes up to 2017. So I would discount the large drop in these last few years. But nevertheless, I think there's a significant result that, about 20% seems a fairly consistent amount, seem to return within the first decade after arrival in the US of immigrants. And this is just men. I'll make that clear. The next slide will show the same results for women. what you see again is there's a downward trend, but you see that the rates do not appear to be nearly as return rates do not appear to be nearly as high as they are for men. So, it's still a 15% return rate or so, but not the 20% rate that we saw with men essentially across all of our immigrant arrival cohorts. So, the first set of results are sort of indicate that there's return migration, and there's return migration of an amount that is somewhat substantial, about 20% within the first decade of arrival in our data set. The next thing we're interested in looking at is, well, what is the immigrant earnings assimilation rate? And really the question is, how long does it take for an immigrant that comes to the US on average to converge to the average earnings of the native-born population? And has it changed over time? And that's some of the things that we'll show you. And so, we ran these regressions to be able to plot the earnings of the immigrants relative to the native-born at different lengths of time in the US, duration. And so the outcome variable is earnings for individual I from a cohort, a rival cohort C, in a year T. And we essentially look at the log of earnings and estimate a coefficient on that. We also have cohort fixed effects, a person age fixed effects, and an error term. And what we'll be plotting are the coefficients on these natural log of earnings, again, which are relative to the native born. And I'll show them to you in graphical form, because I think that's the clearest way of showing that. And we'll separate our results by gender, and then later we'll even disaggregate by arrival cohort. I'll show you what that looks like. And what this allows us to do is to estimate the immigrant versus native earnings differential for a portion of our data anyway, for the first 20 years in the US. And again, as I mentioned earlier, our definition of immigrants or return migrants are those who have consecutive years of zero earnings following some amount of positive earnings at some point in the W-2 Social Security data. And then we estimate these assimilation trajectories separately for the population of individuals that return migrate, as well as those who stay in the US for all time periods in our data set. And then we add those two together, which essentially gives us what's a repeated cross-section to see, what the differences are if in the absence of panel data, what different types of biases or inferences might be made. And there's a little bit of differences, and we'll show that to you in the figure coming up. So here is the long-run earnings assimilation of immigrants. So the way I read this is, again, looking at the x-axis, it's years since migration. So you start at year 0, and again, for a portion of our data is about 37 years, you can get for at least some of the cohorts about 20 years worth. Some of the more recent ones, obviously you can't. And then along the y-axis here, we have the relative log earnings. And so 0 essentially means convergence with the native born. So these points that you see plotted here are essentially the coefficients from that regression that I just showed you earlier. And we've also disaggregated the data, as I mentioned, into 3 different groups. The red maroon dots are permanent immigrants. That's this higher line here. So that's the population that we see in the data at one period, and we record them with earnings over all time periods. The other group that we have are those who have, arrived with that same immigrant cohort and have, at least 1 or 2 years worth of reported earnings in the formal labor market, and then have subsequent 0 or missing earnings for all periods thereafter. And that's this green line. So we consider those the return migrants. We know that at some period, this population is no longer going to be in the US. And then the the combination of those two gives us what is represented by this blue line, or what would be a typical repeated cross-section set of analyses. And so what does it show us? Well, I'll draw your attention to a number of things in this figure, and I'll show you a couple more of these coming up. But going through this one in detail, I think, is useful because it'll set up the other figures to come. So the first thing that I note here is that in sort of the year of arrival, you see that the earnings differential between native-born and immigrants are quite large. They're, -1 log point, which is a large amount, in log terms. And we argue that that's actually not a good point in which to measure someone's earnings. And for the following reason: a person can arrive anytime from January 1st to December 31st. And then mechanically, if that's what you're measuring, relative to a native-born person who's probably working, 50 weeks out of the year, you're going to mechanically get this arbitrarily large deficit. And so what we argue is that you should be measuring people's earnings the subsequent year, when they're probably there for the entirety of the year. And lo and behold, when you do, you see that there's still, immigrants still start off at a lower set of earnings relative to native-born, but it's almost half that amount, right? It's -0.6 or -0.6 log points as compared to 1.2 or 1.4 down here. So that's 1 point. The second is that the earnings assimilation, so again, the convergence to that of native-born, which is represented by the 0 line here, happens faster than it does in the repeated cross-section data, which is represented by the blue line. So, immigrants over this 20-year trajectory seem to appear to converge to that on average, before year 15. But if you use repeated cross-section data, you're going to get a slower rate of income growth, earnings growth. And it suggests that it would take 20 years to observe earnings assimilation for an arbitrary immigrant arrival cohort. So that's sort of informative of what the benefits of having panel data, being able to truly see the long-term population of migrants in the U.S. and their earnings assimilation. And the reason for that differential is that the population of return migrants tend on average to be far below that of the long-term immigrants. Their earnings trajectory is continually growing up, it's converging, but it's continually growing over time. On the other hand, we see that the earnings differential for the group that eventually is going to leave the US is fairly flat. It starts off low, less than -0.5, and continues on average at that level, and doesn't ever see an earnings growth over this time. Okay, should I stop there? Is there any questions regarding this before I go on?
Andy, there's a question from Nick Irons. Are these earnings relative to the national average or relative to a similar native cohort with regards to age or time since entering the labor force?
Yeah, so it's relative to native-born population, same age group, and all race ethnicities that are native-born in the U.S.
In that same time,
same time period, yeah. And same
cohort.
Age.
Yeah,
absolutely, yes. So this was for men, and now I'll show you the similar figure for women. So again, qualitatively very similar, and actually the earnings assimilation for women appear to be faster. It happens, in years 7 or 8 for women in the permanent immigrant population. Happens a little bit later, about 12 or 13 years, if you were to look at repeated cross-section. And again, you see the same sort of horizontal line for their return migrants in terms of their earnings trajectories. Okay. So, what I was showing you in the previous 2 figures were sort of the summation of all of our immigrant cohorts over all years, averaged out. What I'm showing you now are six figures for the arrival cohort that arrived in 1983. The next one is 89, 95, 2000, 2004, and 2007. And these are all for men. And so, what I'll draw your attention to, which I think is, or we think is kind of interesting, is that first of all, the origin level of earnings over time. If you look here, it's less than, it's about a negative 0.7 log points, and starts creeping up over the 90s. And then in the early 2000s, it's above negative 0.5, and kind of is consistently above negative 0.5 log points into the 2000s. So that's suggestive of the fact that more recent immigrant cohorts of men, at least in the formal labor force, tend to have more labor force skills that translate into higher earnings, at least again in relative to earlier arrival cohorts in the 1980s in the US. The second thing that I think is interesting and draw your attention to as well is that the green line here, which again, remember, are return migrants, again, on average, their earnings trajectory is relatively flat over these first few set of years. But then in the 2000s, you see that there's this downward trajectory, which is quite interesting and seems to hold up for all these subsequent immigrant arrival cohorts, which is suggesting that not only are immigrants in prior years and prior decades, it seemed that the population that at some point was going to go home always had a level difference in their earnings, no matter how long they remained in the U.S. But in more recent years, immigrants who had a bad fit, bad match, perhaps with an employer, realize actually downward earnings. Somehow they're being demoted, or hours cut back, or something to that effect. That year after year, the longer they stay, actually the worse off they are. And so it's sort of perhaps a spiraling down process that seems to be relatively new as compared to the process in prior decades. And so again, this is for men, and this is the same results for women. And here, you still see this downward trajectory of earnings for the return migrant populations year after year. The thing that you don't see the same, or at least not as big of an impact, is the change in the initial earnings. There's some upward movement, but it's not nearly as large or a pronounced jump as it was for men. It moved about 1 log point between 1983 and 2007. Here for women, it moves about half of a log point. So the other thing we were interested in is sort of thinking about this line here, this green line, years since migration. And so what I'm going to show you in the next slide is this line, this green line, disaggregated by years in the US. So this entire green line is composed of people who stay in the US for 1 year, 2 year, all the way up to 10 years. So we wanted to see what that looks like for if we separate it by years, their earnings year by year into just a single figure. And so this again is for men. And what we see is that, the earnings for an individual or a group of individuals who arrive in 1983 and only stay for 1 additional year until 1984, this is the earnings trajectory. It goes down. And again, mechanically, this makes sense because you probably left at some point in 1984. And you may not have stayed the entire calendar year. And so again, your earnings compared to the prior year went down. And you see that's sort of the case for all of these. So I would discount these year before, these year of leaving downward trajectories. So instead, what I draw your attention to is sort of what happens in the year before that. Is there a downward trajectory? And it does look like there's some of that in some of these cohorts, that there's this downward trajectory. But on average, if you look here across all of the cohorts, it seems to be pretty horizontal, right? This red line, the brown line, the gray line, the yellow line. There seems to be, there's some noise, but by and large, the year prior to leaving and the year prior to that, your earnings is about the same, which again maps directly into the aggregate of this, which is the line that I showed you, the green line in the other figures. So now I'll contrast this with the year 2007 arrival cohort, which is the next slide. So I think, it's kind of clear, again, if you disregard the last year of earnings, which again, mechanically we believe goes down, it is quite striking that an immigrant who is in the US for 7 years sees, consistently downward earnings trajectory. If you're here for 10 years, you also see downward earnings trajectory. If you're here for, I don't know if this is 6 years, there's, a bump up, but mostly a downward earnings trajectory. And, we're open to discussion about this and insight that people might have on it. One of the things that we suggest is that, there's a churn in the labor market, and there's, employee-employer mismatch. And the group of return migrants are those that have, consistently bad matches and are continually, seeing these, realizations of employers and or having to find new employment, but at increasingly low, at decreasing level earnings, and at some point crosses a threshold and they decide to return migrate. So
we have a quick question from Mark Ellis, and I'll just ask it. He's did you or can you control for the differences in the distribution of immigrants and natives across local labor markets that have markedly different income levels?
So we have not done any of that. You're asking, like, New York versus California or something like that, I suppose.
Yeah,
we haven't done any of this. This is totally all national. Yeah, I think that's something that could be done in subsequent work for sure, but has not. Yeah, absolutely not.
I'll maybe when you're done, when you're getting to the point of wrap up, maybe Mark will come back on and follow up.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. Yeah, I'm almost done anyway. But yeah, it would be great to hear about that. Thoughts on that. And so, we, as I said, we looked at return migration, and here's just a disaggregation by country, just to give you a sense of, how things have changed over time. The gray blue line is 1983, and the purplish line bar is 2007, and return migration to Mexico is much higher proportionately in 2007 than it was in the 80s, and this is for men. Same thing for India, Philippines, China, El Salvador. So there's a relatively higher return rates than we saw historically, at least at the beginning of our data. For women, we see approximately the same thing. And remember, the height here, not as high as that of men, and we saw that earlier as well in the very first set of figures that I showed you. Interestingly, for El Salvador, the return rate is about the same as it was in the 80s. Again, we don't have any causal discussions of this. We're sort of just reporting the facts here. We think there's room for lots of really interesting things to dig through. Why El Salvador would look like this, and all the other high flow sending countries would look like this, and why just for the women, right? It doesn't look like that for the men here. So lots of interesting things, and we're not posing them yet here. And then the last thing is the earnings differential, which I showed you the aggregate graphs of over time for men, and again showed you that they were increasing over time from the early 80s to the 2000s. So this is the same sort of measure, except it's Mexico. We're looking at the top flow immigrant countries over time. In 1983, Mexicans who migrated to the U.S. could expect, their relative log earnings relative to the native born to be, negative 0.75. But by 2007, it was, negative 0.25. So it had gone up by, half of a log point. Indians, people coming from India, men would see a net positive increase relative to native born men, right? So a stark difference. And you see that's the only one that goes from a net negative to a net positive earnings differential to native born from any of the immigrant flow countries. But nonetheless, all of the countries large immigrant flow countries, the Philippines, China, El Salvador, all witness, relative improvements between 1983 arrival cohorts and 2007. Now I'll show you the same results for women. And, here the striking differences both for Indians and immigrant women from the Philippines, their earnings since 1983 to 2007 are on average net positive. And there have been gains for other groups. China, it seems to be about a wash for the most part. But again, very interesting results by gender in terms of initial earnings in the US for immigrants by country of origin. So just to conclude in this slide, what we think we're describing here is that a large share of people emigrate from the US within 10 years of arrival. For women, it's, anywhere from 10 to, 15%. For men, it can be somewhere between 20 to 25%. The entry wage penalties are lower and over time across recent cohorts, and earnings parity with natives is achieved faster for the more recent cohorts, just because they're closer to that line, in more recent years. And the earnings trajectories for return migrants are consistently lower than those of permanent. So we showed you the red sort of line that I was showing you as compared to the green line. And then in more recent years, we've noticed a downward slope in the earnings trajectory for eventual return migrants. And then finally, the country level heterogeneity suggests that changing sending country composition plays a role in the assimilation trends that we observe. There's certain countries that their earnings, their initial earnings are above that of the native born, and that increased flow from places like China and India in particular may be driving some of the results that we observe. And with that, I'll stop the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Randy. That was great. That was super interesting. And we have a lot of people who have some experience working with administrative data, so I think it was fun for them to see these data as well. I want to ask my other hosts to we usually can bring people in to ask their questions, and I can't seem to do that with my functionality. So I was hoping someone else hosting could do that for me, and so that Mark could ask his question with a follow-up, maybe with some ideas. So that would be Grace or Gianna could help with that. Oh, there we go. Okay, Mark, you can ask away or offer your reflections.
No, I'm just sort of generally interested in when making comparisons between groups when they have very, very different geographies. So groups that are concentrated in high wage locations like New York, and then comparing them to a national population, or groups that are concentrated in tech cities like San Jose or Seattle, how that matters. And in terms of understanding the changes over time as immigrant geography has become more dispersed, that could play a role in some of the different patterns you're finding over time. I'm not sure how to do it because it gets complicated by internal migration patterns and so on and so forth. But that also could play an interesting role in terms of modeling these changes over time. Just thoughts, anyway.
It's a really good thought, and I do think we could. So the regression that I showed you, we controlled for year effects and age effects. We didn't control for state effects or county effects, and that is something we could do.
Right.
You could at least be right, because if it's you're located in Los Angeles County, and proportionally there's more people in Los Angeles County than immigrants in Los Angeles than some other county. Yeah. Anyway, I guess the point is we could make the comparisons be within sort of certain geographies, and that's not a bad idea, because I think this is just 100% national. But I think you're right. I mean, we could also stratify the data in other ways too, sort of urban versus rural, and there's clearly. Right. I mean, I think some of the observations that we don't have are the informal labor market, those employed in agriculture, of course, and that would be mostly rural, obviously. Yeah, so that there would, and so we actually haven't thought at all about the geographic dimensions here, and it might also account for what you're saying is that there's been differential distribution over time,
Right.
where people settle. Yeah, and which is absolutely correct. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. I guess, Nick, your turn to ask a question.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I would love to see how some of these trends break down by industry. It sounds like you maybe don't have access to that kind of data, but just seeing how these temporal trends in what industries are being occupied by migrant workers would be interesting.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't think we have that information on the W-2s. I think we have EIN, and the EIN's employer identification number, I think, might map to some sort of industry, but I don't think it was like readily available, and that's why we didn't do that, because that seemed like that was something we thought of, not the geography part actually, but the industry, and I think that was really difficult to do. So having said that, I have another paper, and I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier about sort of the using census data, which matches data from the American Community Survey, which allows you to identify people who have arrived in that year that are surveyed in the ACS, and then match them to IRS data in a longitudinal fashion with a colleague who works at the census there. And in that analysis, because it's the ACS and it asked you, we were able to stratify by industry, at least the industry that you first worked in as an immigrant, right? Because you may have changed jobs. And I have to look back. I don't remember what the difference was. I think there was greater rates of assimilation actually in things like I think it was sales and retail, which was kind of interesting, than in other types of employment, in types of industry. But yeah, anyway, in that, and I'll just say that set of analysis was what led to working with this data, which that data set was just a single year arrival cohort of 2005. But anyway, yes, I think that's one of our limitations in this data set, is that it doesn't contain that information.
And were there countries where you noticed a higher rate of return migration?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, yeah, I think we only looked at the top 5 sending countries and looked at their return migration rates, but I don't think we looked to see what was the number one, like proportionately. But we could figure that out too. Yeah. I mean, do you think there's some sort of there'd be something interesting in that, like in an OECD? I assume it would be an OECD country or something like that doing better than the US, or yeah.
Well, I would think that, so like there have been a lot of immigrants from India and China in recent years that work in the tech industry. And so I imagine return migration rates might be lower for them, and because they're in higher earning jobs, whereas other countries send workers with different skills who might be more likely to return eventually.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know. I think it's like, I think it was Canada or something that has a really high return rate. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the number one, like, proportion to their the amount sending that's the highest. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
Great. Good questions. Well, welcome Jamie Goodwin-White from UCLA, also former alum of UW. So we're happy to have you here.
Oh, thanks, Sarah. Hi, and hi, Randy. I'm just wondering, looking at your results by gender look so striking that they have me wondering whether you can control for kind of household structure or something like that, because of course there are really different propensities for return migration as that would result. They're probably intersecting with Mark's question, different interactions between wage assimilation and propensities for return migration by region, by proximity to the border, those sorts of things, labor market conditions.
So the answer is, I don't think we can in the W-2 data, and I don't believe we have any of the 1040 data. That's available, I believe. Census has IRS data, where that can be, inferred and backed out, of course. So I think that was our limitation in this, is that we have W-2 earnings data, and not, people's filing status, which would allow you to infer marital status. So we don't have that, I believe, and that's why we didn't work on that, or we didn't try to disentangle that. And so, I think in the most stringent sense, we just report the male findings, but the fact that we had women seemed like a good thing to report, even with this limitation, in terms of whether or not they're tide movers or not, or married upon arrival in the U.S. or not. So I think those are really good questions. Obviously, good questions, for the literature, but I don't think we can do any work on that.
Be nice if you could link it to an IRS record or something.
Yeah, well, which that data does exist, obviously, right. and yeah, there's always hope. Yeah.
I mention it because Mark is working with IRS.
Well, there you go.
Yes. Well, thanks. Good question. Good, interesting response. David Grombowski.
Hi, Randy. Very nice talk. I had the previous question about women, differential rates about women. When I saw that, what I immediately thought of was child rearing. Women having children, perhaps wanting to retain them in American schools, could create inertia for return migration because of young children, and as a gender specific kind of force. But the question that I was wondering about was that since your time series includes the Great Recession years, and things started happening around 2007 and 2008, which is, stepping into the Great Recession, was there possibility that the Great Recession reduced economic opportunities in the United States and may have been the subtle push, to increase return migration?
So that, I think that's, we've had another reviewer also mention that exact point, that the downward earnings trajectory for the return migrants really does look to be sort of the turning point is once you get to the Great Recession period. And so that's something we hadn't visually just seen until somebody pointed it out. So I think you're the second person to raise that. And I think that's something we definitely are interested in. And it might be that, again, this idea of sort of employer-employee matching it matters more, whatever. I say that, but it might not be that. It might just be sort of, attitudes towards immigrants and or, I don't know. There might be other things that have changed that are driving this, and, economics based and because we have had obviously other recessions over this time period, but nothing as big as the Great Recession. So yeah, maybe that was like a spark that, changed the outcome. And so I think that's something we're interested in. And, we've got this first paper and hope to get it out, but I think diving into some of these other aspects of it are still, there's still rich work to understand some of those results, because they're what would drive it and why would it be, again, like I said, I think it's pretty clear, consistently, steadily, decreasing, no matter if you're staying 1 year, or 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. And that just seems really, it's striking in that sense, as compared to, again, the earlier cohorts where it was like, everybody was just, piddling along, but not doing worse than your last year's worth of work. So anyway, the short answer to it is, it looks like it might be related to that. And the question is, what's the causal mechanism? And we don't know just yet. Yeah. One of the other things we were thinking about, because I said what we do have is, we don't have tons of stuff, as I mentioned, but we do have employer identification number. So we can see whether or not people have changed their employment between these years, right? Like, is it you're constantly changing jobs and you're constantly getting, you know, a worse fit. So that's something we can do. The other thing we can do is look at and see. So we don't have information because it's, again, W-2s. We don't have the number of hours worked, but we could at least look to see if there are, you know, more than one W-2, right? And we also got 1099s as well. Sort of, it's W-2s plus it's all of the, you know, earnings of a person. So we can see whether or not that is something that has changed. You know, you've got less secure employment, which wouldn't be surprising to us. And you have more part-time employment or something to that effect. So that is something that we've been thinking about recently.
Yeah. And I have to jump to another meeting, but thank you. And
thanks for your question. I appreciate it.
And something you can always put into a discussion section.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Well, there's an anonymous attendee. I don't know who it is, but who asked the follow-up question with regards to the children, how, you know, how ceasing work might and raising children might affect the data.
So again, our definition of, you know, return migrant is sort of this idea that you're earning, and then if you disappear for 1 year, but you come back, and even if you come back after 5 years, we don't consider you as a return migrant. You just have to have, you know, at some point in the future. And so we don't throw you out, or we don't exclude you as a permanent resident or, you know, resident of the US. So we do account for that possibility. That possibility is why in the later cohorts, it might look like there are more people that have returned proportionally, have returned migrated, because we don't have, you know, a lot of years. We only have like 10 years there. But we specifically try to allow for, you know, gaps in employment or gaps in, you know, positive wages to not completely disqualify you, because we think that would be, yeah, it would absolutely change the dynamics for childcare, or even somebody who decided to go back to school, for instance, right, to take a, you know, get a professional degree for perhaps, or because again, this is the population 25 to 45. Who primarily would be maybe getting additional years of education. So we do kind of allow for that. But yeah, that's the result. And I see there's another question.
Yeah.
We're likely to exit and re-enter the data set. You know, that's a good question. And I think we can analyze that as well. So I guess the question is, were we more likely to see sort of, you know, and I guess the answer probably would be true, is that, you know, for men, you'd see a more continuous set of earnings over all years. And for women, you'd see, you know, a missing, perhaps more than likely. And we haven't analyzed that. I think we could figure that out. And that would probably indicate children to some extent. Yeah, childcare.
Thanks, Randy. Thanks. We got some good comments and questions for you. I hope it was helpful.
This was really
and
great.
It was great to learn about your work and your research. And thank you for taking time to join us. Again, Jessica wants to remind everybody that the students get to meet up with you and learn from you at 3 p.m. today, 3 p.m. our time. And I hope you have a good rest.
Again in the chat for those who, thank you, Gianna.
Great. Thanks. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the questions.
Thanks. And we'll hope we see you in person someday.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.